Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is Sunday, February 16th, 2020. Today we're going to be covering, for this segment, Chapter 3 of the Adam and Eve story. And the other story I have for you today is a research paper explaining the corollaries between sunspot minimums and plague cycles. So I'm going to go ahead and get into Chapter 3 of the Adam and Eve story. I know I've been covering a lot of current events lately. It's kind of kept me away from my main project, or the project I started on here at this channel, which is the coverage of the whole entire book of the Adam and Eve story. That is, of course, the declassified version. So let's go ahead and pull up Chapter 3. Begin to take a look at things here. I might have to put on my regular I'm blind as a bat glasses to read, which will give me an excruciating migraine on account of my traumatic brain injury, but I'm going to do it anyway. Let's begin. Chapter 3 starts on page 25, titled The Story: Enigma, Pursuit, and Unraveling. Here we go. It's funny how some things can plague you from your childhood years through your adult years. Not big things necessarily, but little things, which don't exactly persist, but annoyingly stick their heads through your life's door and say, boo. Just to let you know, they're still there. And if I made a list of all these things in my life, it might take up a whole book. I'd like to talk about just one of these bugaboos from the first time I heard the story of the creation in Adam and Eve. Even as a child, it bothered me. To me, the answer wasn't simply one of two usual alternatives: either unquestioning faith in the story as it stands, or complete repudiation as utter nonsense. No, the answer seemed to lie elsewhere. If the story were taught as the truth so uniformly, in spite of its apparent divergence from scientific truths, then to me, the true course would seem to be a search for the foundation of the story, which would then lead to a true reading of it. The pursuit happened almost by accident. Years of data correlation in studying cataclysmology has shown the last cataclysm to have occurred about 7,000 years ago. That Noah, or Utnapishtim, or whatever his name was, did exist and survive that cataclysm. A friend of mine suggested that Genesis 1 is almost a perfect description of conditions on our planet right after a cataclysm, including about a week following on rereading it. I had to agree. Genesis 2 even mentions that a mist, proper translation, inundation, arose from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Well now, this was worth thinking about. If it were so, then it would be the cataclysm preceding Noah's, another fascinating story, about 11,500 years ago. This then could be approximately the time of the Adam and Eve story. I'm going to go ahead and make a quick note here. I do give commentary as I read this. Proper translation: inundation arose from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. I do believe that is what David Dubine has been talking about when he describes liquefaction events, specifically the liquefaction event which destroyed the Tartarian Empire and erased them thusly from history. I have high fears and worries that such a liquefaction event may be about to occur here in Florida. Those of you who are local to Florida, you already know the insane home insurance rates that come from the risk of sinkholes here in the state, especially if you happen to live in Pasco County, west of US 19. That'll be something I will be going out into the field eventually and looking at even further. I apologize for the big segue. I'll be getting back here into the story right now. The pursuit started. If the story did originate with that cataclysm, in what language was it first written? Certainly not Hebrew or Greek, for as far as we know, they didn't even exist at that time. Was it possible to delve into the vanished pages of prehistory and find both the language and the story as originally written? If we look to men such as Don Antonio Barres, Jarike, and James Churchward, we may have our answer. Certainly their knowledge of prehistoric languages could be a key. And later we'll discuss the role of Naga, the ancient Mayan in the story of Adam and Eve. First, however, let's examine the history of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. There are many schools of thought on this subject. The predominant one is that Moses was the originator. This seems not obtuse, since Moses was reared in the Egyptian tradition. In a royal household, he probably had access to many religious writings and teachings, now lost with the passing of the archives in Egypt. Of course, that's talking about the burning of the library in Alexandria. In Alexandria, Heliopolis, and Sais. Certainly the Ten Commandments were a condensation of the 42 questions of Osiris for entering heaven. And if Moses did write part of the Old Testament, he then must have had Naga tablet writings, or Egyptian interpretations of them, handed down to the Egyptians for thousands of years through the royal households, and the Egyptian priesthood had knowledge of a cataclysm 11,500 years ago from our present time. Priests of Egypt are supposed to have told Solon during his 10 years in Egypt, about 600 BC, that 9,000 years before that time, there was a cataclysm which buried Atlantis beneath the ocean. Note that 9,000 plus 600 BC plus 1,950 AD equals 11,550 years ago. Excuse me. Got gunk in my eye there. Moses' brother, Aaron, became the first chief priest of the Hebrews about 1,300 BC. Somewhere between 15 and 18 generations later, the chief priesthood, having been handed down from father to son through the generations, Sariah, or Sarias, was the chief priest. See Ezra 1 and 2, Esdras. Later in 586 BC, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Sariah was executed, and his son Ezra made a captive of Persia. See the 2 Kings. Jerusalem was sacked, and all Hebrew laws and records of the Old Testament were burned with the temple at Jerusalem by Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's captain of the guard. Next page. In 458 BC, the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign in Persia, Ezra was commissioned to reestablish the Hebrew religion and law. According to the 2 Esdras, Ezra rewrote the history of the Hebrews from the beginning and reestablished their laws. Now from 586 to 458 BC is 128 years. The latest that Ezra could have been born was after his father Sariah's execution, as well could be, see Onan's story, Genesis 38:8 through 10. Therefore, the youngest he could have been in 458 BC was 127. Of course, we've heard a lot of stories about how much longer people's lifespans were back in the extreme ancient days. But this is going back to a time post-cataclysm, after Adam and Eve, when supposedly human lifespans were diminished and shortened significantly more. The latest that Ezra could have been born was after his father's execution. Right, that would have made him 127. He was working on a long memory. Now let's examine this anomaly. As mentioned before, the lineage from Aaron to Ezra contains from 17 to 20 generations. Generations about 75 years in the modern era, including Aaron and Ezra, assuming 1,300 BC to be the start of Aaron's priesthood, 1,290 BC is adjudged to be the time of the Exodus, and 458 BC to be the near of the end of Ezra's priesthood. Then we find the average priesthood term per generation to be between 42.1 and 49.5 years. In view of this, can we believe that Ezra served his priesthood for approximately 130 years, which includes his entire lifespan? It would appear much more plausible to assume that it was Ezra's grandfather, Azariah, rather than his father, Sariah, who was the one who was taken and executed by Nebuchadnezzar's men in 586 BC. Then Sariah and Ezra would have served as chief priests from 586 to 458 BC for an average of 64 years apiece. It is even plausible that Ezra's great-grandfather, Hilkiah, could have been the victim in 586 BC, leaving Azariah, I believe that's Nezariah, and Ezra to serve the 128 years for an average of 42 years each, which is even closer to the overall average of 42.1 to 49.5 years from Aaron to Ezra over a period of about 845 years. This means that the Adam and Eve story was last written when in writing by Hilkiah or Azariah, therefore handed down verbally, possibly by Azariah, and certainly by Sariah and Ezra, and finally dictated to Ezra to 5 scribes. It is these 5 scribes' writings that we have today as Ezra's work, and the English is not even a literal translation. For instance, quote, without form and void, more literally would read, raging in inundations and horrendous winds. Without form and void, more literally would read, raging inundations and horrendous winds. Jesus. Now, through Ezra's reconstruction of Genesis, we are told many things. 1. Because of the use of tree, fruit, serpent, cherubim, sword of fire, and other words of Moses, which were glyphs in the picture language of prehistory, it is evident that the creation of Adam and Eve stories were probably written in the glyphs of Naga, the predominant Eastern Hemisphere language of 11,500 years ago. This language is nearly identical to prehistoric Mayan, and the progenitor of many languages, which include Oriental and Polynesian tongues, Egyptian, Greek, and Yakut. My own language of prehistoric, or my own knowledge of prehistoric Naga and Mayan glyphs enables me to read many Indian blankets of the southwestern United States, which have woven into them colorful glyphs depicting a cataclysm. Having Native American heritage myself, I can say that's actually absolutely true. I'll be covering some of the many pictures of petroglyphs that can be seen out in the American West. They're very fascinating, and I do hope someday to be able to travel out there and cover these things live and on scene. I wonder if the Indians are chuckling to themselves knowing that the tourists think they are buying blankets of just pretty pictures. Yakut is an interesting language. It is almost pure spoken Naga. It is spoken by Alaskan Eskimos. The town of Yakutut means the place where Yakut is spoken. Ironically, this language is also spoken by a native tribe in Turkey. Naga is almost its purest prehistoric form, is spoken by a tribe in northern India. It is pure prehistoric Mayan. All these civilizations, thousands of miles apart from each other, somehow we managed to find congruency. This is a mystery that remains to be solved. Moses certainly and possibly Aaron had access to the royal Egyptian glyph stones library. Moses certainly and possibly Aaron had access to the royal Egyptian glyph stones library. I read that twice. Neither Moses nor Aaron knew how to read the Egyptian glyph languages of Naga or Mayan, therefore read the glyphs quite literally. Not being able to read the symbolism of the glyphs in addition to reading them literally, Moses and Aaron, and possibly Ezra, read into the Adam and Eve story the social and religious attitudes of their day. In that time, woman was regarded as the root of all sin, a lowly creature, her birth recorded only as an exception, and basically being the cause of man's every downfall. Wow. We'll get into that some more later. Anyway, a daily potential, this attitude persists even in worse forms in some religions, amazingly in our time. Is it any wonder that Eve was shouldered with the responsibility for the downfall of all mankind, as a result of interpretations read into the Naga by Moses, and into Moses' reading by Ezra. Perhaps also it was read into the story by Egyptian priests long before Moses' time, and passed on to him verbally as history. If his father really were the one taken and executed by the captain of the guard, Nebuzaradan, then it had to be his grandfather who passed the story to him verbally. The fusing of two stories, that is, the P and J versions of the Old Testament, into one to make the story of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 may confuse the man with Adam. It is possible that Adam, being only 9 generations ahead of Noah, with a time span of the Sudan Basin polar era covering about 4,500 to 5,000 years, was not the man referred to in the creation, but his name and experiences were merged with the man's story. Remember, however, we are informed that Ezra dictated the entire history to 5 scribes from memory, and this work contains Genesis as we know it today. For him to recall from the archives of his mind what he did, as well as he did, certainly bespeaks of inspiration of a high order. But it also appears evident that he had no knowledge of the fact that 4,500 years transpired between Genesis 1 and Noah's flood. It is clear from 2 Esdras 3:9 that Genesis 1 and Noah's flood were actually 2 inundations. However, for while speaking of the 2 occasions he says of Noah's flood, and again in process of time, thou broughtest the flood upon those that dwelt in the world, and destroyedst them. Now we mentioned before that the lineage of high priests from Aaron to Ezra differs in numbers of generations, either 17 or 20, and names is presented in 1 and 2 Esdras. And both differ in names from the book of Ezra. We also find differences in the lineages from Noah to Jesus, approximately 51 generations. In the Bible, is it any wonder, therefore, that some generations could have been omitted in the Adam to Noah line? Not to mention the Noah to Jesus line and the Aaron to Ezra line. In light of the fact that, in addition to overwhelming evidence, there are countless legends in the Asia Pacific eras handed down from the inundation of 11,500 years ago of a creation much like that of Genesis 1 and 2, is it not possible that the man of the Genesis story became confused with Adam throughout the thousands of years and through a succeeding cataclysm in Noah's time 7,000 years ago? The miracle is that the whole story of creation and of Adam and Eve is as undistorted as it is, being 11,500 years old. It has suffered through many debacles of visited upon its guardians in the intervening years. Because of the lack of resolving information, the man and Adam are kept as one in this translation interpretation. Number 6. The significant Naga glyphs given to us by Ezra through Moses' direct readings are cherubims, rib, Adam's sleep, man, woman, tree, fruit on the tree, serpent, and flaming sword. Our knowledge of Naga glyphs tells us that the tree of life symbolized a mother continent, a parent civilization lasting thousands of years longer than ours of today. That's what these glyphs meant. That's what their interpretations actually rendered. An unadorned serpent represented water in its natural state, or the ocean. A serpent entwined around the tree signified that the mother continent was surrounded entirely by water. Where did it go? Genesis 3:15 actually describes Eve's heel on the serpent's head, depicting her victory over the oceans. Cherubims, which were not pretty plump babies as we have always thought, but glyphs of hybrid man and beast. They were the glyphs for legs or foundations, think in terms of pillars. Pillars of creation. Using a little esoteric symbolism there. They were the glyphs for legs or foundations or underpinnings. Instead of being placed in the Garden of Eden, the foundation was taken away. This would suggest that land fell into the ocean. Instead of being placed in the Garden of Eden, the foundation was taken away. And a Naga or Mayan reading of the Egyptian Book of the Dead shows that cherubims of the north, south, east, and west were taken away, meaning that all the foundations of the mother continent were removed and destroyed. The flaming sword was the symbol of fire and earthquake. The fire signified that all legends of these cataclysms call earth fire, which is the planet-wide molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell, breaking through to the surface during a cataclysm, a literal hell. It is, as far as I have been able to determine, the origin of man's concept of hell. I remember watching John F. Kennedy's funeral on television, and most vividly the incantation given by the Archbishop to keep John Kennedy from the doors of hell. His words went back to pre-Christian Rome, for in describing those gates of hell, he painted a picture of hell exactly like that of the molten sublayer breaking through the Earth's shell. It had to be handed down through thousands of years from one who had actually seen it. Chills ran up and down my spine as it stamped an indelible impression on my mind. Now to the tree. Fruit growing on that tree symbolized the mankind which settled the mother continent ages before Adam and Eve. Their eating the fruit tells us they were descended from this original mankind. Eve eating this first signifies that she was the youngest generation. Adam eating second signifies he was her father, which made her his daughter. His daughter? Yes, it is the origin of one of the oldest Hebrew laws. In a catastrophe, if but a male and female survive, they must mate, regardless of their relationship. If you want to check on this, read the story of Lot and his two daughters. The daughters were simply obeying the Hebrew law. He is stated to be too drunk to know what he is doing. Ha! If he were, he couldn't have performed. He must have been a good actor. The glyph of the creation is even more revealing. There are three figures represented on the stone. The top figure is the face of a sleeping or dead person. There were no separate symbols for death and sleep in Naga. Both were represented as the same. The middle figure is shown as a male, and the bottom figure a female who is represented as the mother of all mankind. In addition, there are curved lines from the sleeping or dead person and the male middle finger to the bottom of the female figure. This glyph has been interpreted to mean that the middle figure, a male, was put to sleep, shown by the top figure, and a rib or ribs was removed from him, the rib being the curved lines, and fashioned into the bottom figure, the female mother of all mankind. This fits beautifully with the story of Eve's creation, Adam therefore being both the male middle figure and the top figure, a sleeping or dead person. There's a hitch to this story, however. The top figure, either sleeping or dead, is depicted as a female. How could it be Adam asleep, awake, dead, or alive? Moreover, in Naga, the curved lines denote parentage rather than ribs. So more reasonably, it appears that the top figure is a dead female whose offspring by the middle figure, Adam, was the bottom female figure, Eve, the mother of all mankind. We've all heard the story of Lilith, Adam's first wife, right? Anyway, I have been asked countless times, how can one tell the top figure to be a dead female? To the extent that I guess I owe an answer here. In Naga and prehistoric Mayan, they show that they worshipped but one deity and represented that deity by a glyph of a circle representing the sun. Anytime a circle was shown on a tablet, it could only represent their deity. This tablet has two circles on it. Purists have stated that the writers of this tablet meant to show double intensity of the deity. Strange. I have never seen anywhere a double intensity of two circles in either Naga or prehistoric Mayan. The curious thing about these two circles is that they are located precisely where a female's breast should be on the top figure. Maybe that's what double intensity is all about. The most curious thing about this stone is that it fits the legend of Adam being a widower and the name of his deceased wife being Lilith. If true, it would also reveal Lilith to be Eve's mother. So in essence, the story as read from the glyphs would be that Adam and Eve, who lived in the Garden of Eden on the mother continent and or tree, were descended from the original mankind fruit of that land, which incidentally was surrounded entirely by water, serpent entwined around the tree. Eve was Adam's daughter, and he was a widower. They realized that in order to survive, they had to leave and never try to return, for the motherland was destined to be destroyed by a cataclysmic inundation. Eve had perceived this coming event, and Adam asked her how she had discovered it. She answered that she had inherited the intelligence to do so from her ancestors. As a result, she had gained victory over the inundation, i.e., Eve's heel on the serpent's head. They left the motherland, and afterward, the continent tree was subjected to a fiery earthquake, i.e., the flaming sword, during which it lost its foundations, cherubims, and sank beneath the ocean, the serpent, which remained forever afterward, burying the continent, forever afterward, crawling on its belly. So let's review the event 2 cataclysms ago, and then apply our knowledge toward a representative translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. It may be the most accurate reading of a story written 11,500 years ago. That ends that chapter. The next chapter is the event. I will be covering that in another segment. Now we're going to begin the next story in this segment, which is regarding this research paper. I will include a link for this below. The title of this research paper is Sunspot Cycle Minima in Pandemics, a case for vigilance at the present time. Here we have the Here we have the research authors of this paper, where the research paper comes from. Actually, none of these researchers happen to be American, it appears. But the research in this paper is incredibly good, I will guarantee that. We'll read the abstract now. Direct records of sunspots and solar cycle have been maintained in astronomical observatories for about 1610 AD, while indirect records derived from carbon-14 analysis of ice cores goes back to about 900 AD. Minima in the sunspot cycle present conditions conducive to the entry of viruses and bacteria to the Earth, and also for mutations of already circulating pathogens. 3 grand minima of solar activity on record: the Sporer minimum from 1450 to 1550 AD, the Maunder minimum from 1650 to 700 AD, and the most recent Dalton minimum from 1800 to 1830, have all been marked by a preponderance of pandemics: smallpox, English wets, plague, and cholera. The sunspot numbers recorded for the present period between 2002 and 2017 include the deepest sunspot minimum cycle between 23 and 24 since records began, and a trend with declining numbers throughout the cycle. The same period has seen the resurgence of several pandemics, including SARS, MERS, Zika, Ebola, and influenza A. We consider it prudent to take note of these facts whilst planning future strategies for pandemic surveillance and control. Keywords in this article are sunspot cycle, panspermia, and pandemics. Introduction. The possibility of linking sunspots with pandemics was first suggested by Hope Simpson in 1977, who pointed out that many pandemics of influenza in history occurred close to times of sunspot maxima. Hoyle and Wickramasinghe, also in 1977, re-examined this proposal using a more extended data set and concluded, although the coincidences were not precise, the 2 sets of data, influenza and sunspot, were phase-locked, such that a causal link was likely. This work was recently extended by Koo, who was one of the researchers in this paper, who found a more generalized result, namely that both certain and possible pandemics fall within plus or minus 2 years of sunspot extrema, maxima, and minima. Maxima in the sunspot cycle are characterized by high daily sunspot numbers, frequent solar flares, coronal discharges, and X-ray emission. High fluxes of X-rays reach the Earth's upper atmosphere, but are almost totally absorbed by the lower atmosphere. A more important property of a sunspot maximum is that the interplanetary magnetic field near the Earth remains high, being generated and maintained by the flow of electrons from the Sun. As such, the Earth would be effectively shielded from the ingress of charged dust grains as well as galactic cosmic ray protons. It is to sunspot minima that we must turn to seek a possible explanation of the onset of pandemics. Sunspot minima are characterized by a weakening of the interplanetary magnetic field near the Earth, which allows for the entry of galactic cosmic rays, or GCRs, as well as electrically charged bacteria and viruses to the Earth. When GCRs collide with the atmosphere, they produce a cascade of secondary particles, including neutrons and muons, that continue to penetrate the atmosphere. The cascade continues until the particle energy becomes too low and GCRs are effectively stopped. This happens at 16 to 20 kilometers. Significantly, neutron fluxes do, however, reach ground level and have the potential of causing mutations in both viruses and cells in general. More significantly, in our view, during a solar minimum, new viruses, bacteria, and other microscopic biological entities can penetrate the interplanetary magnetic barrier. During this time, the magnetic field declines. We know this from other research that over the last, I believe, 200 years, the magnetic field has declined about 25%. And just in the last 15 years alone, it's declined another 15%. We'll look into that more. I don't know that for sure, but I'll have another research paper on that. Don't worry. More significantly, in our view, during a solar minimum, new viruses, bacteria, and other microscopic biological entities can penetrate the interplanetary magnetic barrier and reach the stratosphere. Descent of such particles to ground level by means of gravitational settling might take months or years, depending on size. The final descent phase through the troposphere would be mostly controlled by meteorological events. It is also of interest to note that the first descent of viral-sized particles deposited in the stratosphere will occur at places where the stratosphere is thinnest, and by this argument, populated areas of China lying eastward of the Himalayan mountain range would present the best candidates. That's interesting. This Corona Chan that has wreaked havoc all across China is happening well in China. It goes without saying that the magnitude and amount of evidence would suggest that this actually leaked out of a laboratory is an embarrassment of riches. I digress, and I'll continue with this reading. We should, however, stress that not every minimum in the sunspot cycle would be associated with a new epidemic or new pathogen. Additional conditions need to be fulfilled. Most importantly, that the Earth has recently encountered a stream of cometary debris containing disease-causing dust, e.g., phages, baryons, and microorganisms. Hoyle and Wickramasinghe, 1977, argued that the recurrent patterns of certain pandemics throughout history, exhibiting long periods of dormancy, might be best understood by extinctions followed by reintroductions, possibly involving a long period comet. With the theory of cosmically interconnected biology coming to the fore, such a possibility has currently acquired a renewed balance. In addition, sunspot minima and plagues, in addition to the oscillation of sunspot numbers with a 11-year period, several grand minima where low sunspot numbers persist over several cycles are known to have occurred. Here we have a graph showing maximum and minimal regular 11-year cycles. And the last maximum, see the decline in maximums, the duration of maximums over the last few cycles from 80, then to 90, 2000, and the last maximum coming out of about 2010. I'm going to say this is right around 2013 on this graph. Didn't even last a whole cycle. It went minimum before the cycle completed. And here we are now at the end of this graph in the recent minimum. Here's a longer graph showing sunspot numbers from the Charbonneau et al. Study from going about, looks like 1000 AD to the present year 2000 AD. Here we have a small note here, this particular period being from 1955 to 2000. Sunspots went up and around during that period, but have sharply declined. The Maunder minimum from 1645 to 1715 was marked by an almost total absence of sunspots for many days, and the Dalton minimum from 1790 to 1830 witnessed a significant reduction of sunspot numbers over several cycles. An earlier period of reduced activity from 1400 to 1520 is known as the Sporer minimum, has recently been confirmed indirectly in the proxy record of carbon-14 and barium-10. High fluxes of neutrons coming from the decay of cosmic ray protons during sunspot minimum cause the production of carbon-14 and barium-10, which is deposited in ice cores. Figure 1b shows the 11-year cyclical variation in the number of sunspots since records began. Red curve combining with the two equivalents are based on the production rate of the radioactive nucleotides, carbon-14 and barium-10. The Wolf, Sporer, Maunder, and Dalton minimum are all clearly visible in this record. Let's talk about these diseases. The English sweats that continued through most of the period of the Sporer minimum still remains an unsolved mystery for medical historians. Holinshed's Chronicles, published in 1557, described English sweating sickness as so sharp and deadly that the like was never heard of to any man's remembrance before that time. The disease is said to have begun abruptly with fever, severe body aches, abdominal pain, vomiting, and profuse sweating, and death came swiftly. It has been speculated that a hitherto unknown virus may have been involved. This is in contrast to bubonic plague and the Maunder minimum, as well as cholera and smallpox that are caused by several resident and circulating pathogens that gain pandemic potential intermittently due to mutation or recombination events which presumably involve the acquisition of new genes, i.e. plasmids, phagids, or virions. It is also possible for an epidemic to be triggered when the microflora ecobalance in the upper respiratory tract is disrupted by a new pathogenic invader, thus causing a resident suppressed microorganism to replicate and flourish, causing overt disease. A modern sunspot minimum dating from 2002 to 2015, we're still in that minimum actually, and we're continuing down the line in that minimum. The modern period minimum from 2002 to 2017 has been characterized by the lowest solar activity since the Dalton minimum. In particular, the solar minimum between cycles 23 and 24 was exceptionally protracted with many days of almost no sunspots. Let's see here, coming out of very early 2000s, very little sunspot activity. Going down to 2010, complete crash, very lull, bottom of the minimum there. The next maximum cycle, again, and here we are in the modern minimum on that graph. The link for this paper will be included below. Data from 2004 to 2017 from the database of the Royal Observatory of Belgium. In the legend SC and CM refers to model predictions not relevant to the present study. It was also marked by the lowest recorded values of the interplanetary magnetic field near the Earth, the lowest in 50 years since space measurements began. Itoma et al. 2010. These conditions taken together arguably provide the best opportunity for the onset of pandemics and open gateways offered for the ingress of new pathogens, which are inevitably electrically charged in space. Virions, phages, bacteria, and other micron-sized biological entities can cross the weakened interplanetary magnetic field and readily reach the Earth's surface. It has actually been proven a long time ago, actually, that viruses and bacteria do remain dormant and they float freely in space. They are basically extremophiles and can live out in space, and it's not until they enter the atmosphere of a planet like our own that begin to take hold and infect a bunch of people and other life forms. Here we have this table here showing the years and the resurgences of these diseases, including scarlet fever, which there was an epidemic of from 2010 to 2016. I didn't know much about that. I'll be reading more into that later. An epidemic of particular interest is scarlet fever. This is a disease caused by the bacterium Streptococcus pyogenes and has an antiquity that goes probably back to Hippocrates in the 4th century BC. Judged from the record of historical data in the Christian era, the disease, judged by symptoms alone, appears to have had several exits and entrances with long interludes of remission. The disease emerged as a major scourge at the beginning of the Victorian era, from 1840 to 1883. Scarlet fever is probably the most common childhood infection, leading to high fatality rates in cities throughout Europe and the USA. In England, 2 of Charles Darwin's children are known to have succumbed to this disease. An oscillatory pattern of occurrence of scarlet fever is recorded in death rates per 100,000 in Boston for the period between 1840 to 1940. The incident rates of scarlet fever began to drop dramatically from the 1930s onwards, and particularly after the introduction of antibiotics in the 1950s. Although factors such as herd immunity are widely suggested for the long-term oscillations of incidence, an alternative explanation would be the episodic variability of the genome of the causative bacterial population of S. pyogenes caused by random mutations and/or hybridization. With a changing population of external virions, other pandemics and epidemics of viral diseases that were initiated during this period may also have shared a similar cause. SARS coronavirus first flared up in China in 2002. A decade later, in 2012, an outbreak of MERS coronavirus started in the Middle East and spread sporadically throughout the world. The influenza subtype H1N1, which was involved in both the 1918-1990 pandemic and the epidemics of 1976 and 1977, reappeared in 2009 in India, China, and elsewhere. So what they're saying in this paper is that the H1N1 swine flu is actually the Spanish flu. In 2017, it was raging across Sri Lanka and neighboring countries. In 2013, the influenza subtype H7N9 appeared first in birds and later spread globally. In 2015, the Zika virus, which had been endemic since the 1950s, acquired new characteristics, including the capacity to cause microcephaly. Recently, a gene mutation that caused the changed character of this virus has been identified. In 2014, the Ebola virus, which was first recognized in Zaire, West Africa, in 1976, resurfaced to cause localized epidemics. From past records of the correlation of sunspot cycle, prolonged minima, and pandemics, it is clear that the onset of a deep minimum is a single signal of action. We have stated elsewhere that the sunspot cycle could be a guide for closer scrutiny of circulating viruses, and monitoring their genetic variations. Equally important in our views is to monitor the stratosphere for the presence of viral entities that may pose a pandemic threat if and when they reach ground level. Early balloon collections of stratospheric aerosols, bunch of citations there, need to be refined and more funds devoted to this project if a future pandemic can be avoided. At sea level, we are also proposing to carry out a regular sampling of ocean water in Sri Lanka to detect the arrival of new viruses. Some 10 million viruses have been identified in a single drop of ocean water at any moment, and to keep track of their evolution over time would, in our view, be extremely important. A virus guard project, similar to the Space Guard project proposed by Sir Arthur C. Clarke for detecting asteroids and comets, may be needed to protect us. Sir Arthur Clarke remarked that the dinosaurs became extinct because they failed to initiate a Space Guard project. I think that's very funny. Let us not default in our duty by future generations of humans to start such a virus guard project. That concludes the paper. Everything else included in this is references and the bibliography. I will be including a link for this obviously below. And that is it for this segment, folks. Again, today is Sunday, the 16th of February, 2020. My name is Will Gragel. You are watching the Deep State Chronicle. I wish you all have a great afternoon. I'm going to take a lunch break and get started on this next segment.